Kia ora koutou katoa, e hui tahi nei, e tēnei rā. Greetings and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Richard Smith. I'm the Director of the Resilience National Science Challenge. Pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural science webinar, today on the topic of how communities might adapt to an uncertain future at the coast, a pressing and topical issue with the release last week of the National Coastal Risk Assessment. We have 4 speakers this morning from the Resilience Challenge Coastal Programme: Associate Professor Mark Dickson, Dr. Judy Lawrence, Dr. Rog Bell, who are all live, and a pre-recorded presentation, we hope, by PhD student Rick Kool. The session is planned as a series of 10-minute technical presentations. Each presenter will introduce themselves. The audio quality for Rick's presentation is such that you may have to adjust your volume, so just a heads up about that. We're aiming to have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentations today for questions and answers, and this will be facilitated by Dr. Emma Ryan, who's from the Coastal team. So there's a Q&A function in the event. Please use this at any time throughout the webinar and upvote any questions that you want to see answered in particular. Also keep an eye on that window for links that we'll post to resources that might be mentioned throughout the presentation. And at the end of today's session, a feedback survey. We'd really appreciate any feedback you can give us to help us improve for the next webinar. We're also recording today's webinar and we'll make a copy available on our website and send out a link to that. So now I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Mark, who's co-leader along with Rob of the Resilience Challenge Coastal Programme. Over to you, Mark, and the team.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks for joining us everyone this morning. My name's Mark Dickson. I'm a coastal geomorphologist at the University of Auckland, also co-lead of the coastal program within the Resilience Science Challenge. I'm just going to give you a quick, pretty high-level overview of the coastal research within the challenge, where we've come from and where we're heading, before handing over to Judy and Rick, who will get stuck into some more of the detail around coastal adaptation. I wanted to start by recognising that public concern for our coasts has been growing, obvious to everyone, framed both by threats to property associated with coastal erosion and flooding in New Zealand, but also there are many global science headlines about this now. For instance, one recent paper claimed that by the end of the century, about half of the world's sandy beaches will be lost. So there's real pressure on coastal managers regarding how to plan for the future. The Resilience National Science Challenge has been confronting this challenge through 2 funding cycles. The first of these was the Living at the Edge program, which wrapped up last year, and the current program is called Adapting to New Zealand's Dynamic Coastal Hazards. Living at the Edge was centred on a regional case study in the Hawke's Bay, with research very closely aligned to the development of the Clifton to Tangoyo Coastal Hazards Strategy. Research included a range of mainly social science projects and has resulted in a bunch of lessons learned around the need for collaborative governance and strategy development, the importance of community engagement and ownership in the process, and a bunch of insights into how knowledge flow in all directions can have effect in changing preconceived views over time. Judy will touch on this in more detail shortly, but we've also set up a web page which should be accessible through the QA, which includes a range of publications and policy documents and the like that should be helpful for any of you who are currently working through this type of process. The second phase of the resilience funding sees a shift from regional scale to national scale research. We've framed this work very much around confronting the sort of gradual onset risk that results from future sea level rise, which of course we know is inevitable, but which is also highly uncertain, thus presenting really difficult challenges for coastal communities and managers alike. We've designed 3 interconnected research pillars to try and tackle this problem. I'm going to briefly introduce pillars 1 and 2 now, and Rob will return to these, Rob Bell will return to these at the end of the webinar, and also talk about pillar 3, adaptation, in a bit more detail. So the aim of pillar 1 is to try to deliver nationwide coastal change data sets that are needed to model future impacts. We have 3 PhD students working on this project, together with multiple research scientists and a whole bunch of research assistance as well. Working with LINS, we're obtaining all of the high resolution historical imagery held in New Zealand's Crown Archive, and we've made a good start on the big task of rectifying all of this photography and mapping several decades worth of coastal change around the country. So far we've worked through about 95% of Northland, and we're currently weighing up where in New Zealand to head to next. This historical shoreline change mapping project is very overdue. The last piece of similar work was some 40 years ago now. It's crucial that we update this so that we can identify in a robust way all the erosion hotspots around New Zealand, and then set about the task of trying to unpick the dominant controlling factors. We're also very much aware of the need to keep shoreline maps up to date in the future, and so we're developing new techniques for automatically detecting shorelines from the ever increasing availability of satellite imagery, and this will allow us to generate very much up-to-date coastal erosion shoreline data, as is illustrated here in this this map that we can see for Aotearoa in Northland. The two is led out of the University of Waikato and NIWA, and it's focused on coastal flooding, and in particular it's focused on sort of low-lying estuarine coasts rather than open ocean coasts, which have already been the subject of some excellent work across a number of projects, including the completed hazards program that was the subject of the New Zealand Coastal Society webinar last week. One highlight of the work in Pillar 2 so far is the development of method to extract bathymetry data from estuaries using satellite data. And this type of technique is going to be very important for future efforts in this pillar to model flooding in many of our estuaries nationwide, for which we currently don't have detailed data sets. The final thing I wanted to say before I hand over to Judy is that the National Climate Change Risk Assessment was released earlier this week, and it emphasises the high research priority required associated with the risks to Maori cultural heritage associated with sea level rise. And in this regard, Mātauranga has been central in the ongoing development of a number of projects within the erosion and flooding pillars, and we'll be pleased to update you on these projects in upcoming years as they develop. Okay, over to you, Judy.
Kia ora tātou. I'm going to talk about some of the things that have been motivating the work that we've been doing, and which we have developed in some of the other science challenges, notably the Deep South. And we've brought those into the Resilience Science Challenge, and I have been testing them in real life situations. And I'm going to talk about one of those in particular. We have developed from the coastal hazards and guidance for local government on the left-hand side, a heuristic that can be used for making decisions. The science can only be useful if we can actually use it in the real life situations, and for that we need systematic processes for making those decisions. So we have this tool on the left-hand side which asks these 5 simple questions around the outside. What's happening? What matters most? What can we do about it? How can we implement the strategy, and is it working? And these broadly relate to identifying the hazards in 1 and 2, understanding community values and the vulnerability and risk, as Mark had outlined, and then developing options and pathways for the future. And on the right, we have an example of how we might do this, a bit like navigating the metro in a large city. And we identify options and we test them to see whether they, under what conditions would they fail. And we use scenarios to do that. And there are 2 of them at the bottom there with the zigzag line in the middle. And to do that, we also need signals and triggers to identify ahead of time to warn us when we might need to make different decisions and thus shift between the different pathways. And so this is one of the tools that we've developed over time, and which we've applied in the Hawke's Bay in a specific example. We've also learned some lessons from applying this, and we've written this practice brief, which is in the Planning Quarterly magazine for those of you who are members and have access to it. And they're broadly about the enabling conditions that are necessary to undertake these processes and to actually apply them. And having communities at the centre of this enables these processes to be made transparent. We need governance that actually works for the community with representation from mana whenua, which is what happened in the Hawke's Bay through the Living Edge program. And we need cross-scale governance. In other words, central, local and regional government all working together on these issues. Early partnership with iwi and hapu is absolutely essential because we can learn a lot from iwi and hapu about long-term planning and how we can stage our activities over time. And we've also used dynamic adaptive pathways planning, which we broadly call DAP, and you'll hear that acronym across this discussion. And that can be scaled at space and over time, and it enables shifts from the short term to the long term. So we can identify short-term options and we can hedge, if you like, for the long term. And we also need fundamentally regulatory planning, funding, design and costing and monitoring and review as the enablers for these adaptive strategies. And very helpfully, the Randerson review under looking at the RMA has come up with some very interesting suggestions for managing those issues, which are essential and at the moment missing in the regulatory environment. So the principles that we've developed, and we've recently published this paper with a bunch of us, including Jonathan Boston and 3 postgraduates and an economist, Adolf Strombergen. And what we've come up with is that we need clear, consistent and transparent policy goals to be identified to do this work. We need to know why we're doing this and what we're doing. And we need really sound anticipatory governance and robust coordination between levels of government, and thinking about managed retreat as being, if you like, a strategic first best option. In other words, you're thinking that something will be inevitable and you need steps to get there. And they're really important issues around public compensation and incentivising managed retreat. We can't retreat from the coast unless this issue of public compensation and funding is actually dealt with. And to do that, we need multi-party agreement and long-term commitment devices. So finally, we had a student, Sam Olofsson, do his master's in 2019. And he took the DAP thinking and applied it into how could you sequence and cost managed retreat. And in this case, he broke it down into these 6 groupings. We make a decision that long-term managed retreat is necessary, and we start with the consultation with the community and the early discussions. And we plan, we make provision in our planning instruments where we're not continuing to lock in developments. And we're looking at places where alternative investment and alternative property acquisition can take place so that people have somewhere to move to. And then, it's only then that the active retreat would take place and the cleanup and the monitoring and reviewing of it occur over time. So this will be available. There's a link to the thesis that those of you who are interested can go into in the Resilient Science Challenge website. And I'll now introduce our second master's student who undertook looking at, well, what would we do about infrastructure? How would we deal with that, taking a DAP approach? And he came from Denmark at the Danish Technical University, and he developed a routine for how one would approach this in the Petone area. So I'll hand over now to the recording from Kool, who has just gone back out of lockdown to the Netherlands.
Good morning. In this webinar, I would like to discuss the results of my thesis, Preparing for Sea Level Rise through an Adaptive Managed Retreat of a Two Waters Network. The contents of this webinar will mainly be about the study area, then we'll go into the research question, And from there on, we'll chronologically go through the research. Study area is the Petone area in Lower Hutt in the Wellington region. The figure that you can see here is also the geographic boundary that's used for the study, and the mainly gravity-based drainage infrastructure is expected to be increasingly affected by sea level rise, which is indicated in this figure, where you can see that the sea is coming up, getting into the pipes and reducing the hydraulic head and therefore the discharge capacity of the system. We can also see ponding occurring in the lower parts of the study area, and it's expected that this is further increased by increases in discharge due to increased precipitation. Therefore, we framed the research questions following. How could the retreat of the two-water infrastructure, so that means stormwater and wastewater, be managed alongside a community retreat at the coast? We used the DAP approach to frame this, and we mainly looked into the sequencing of the retreat. We looked into the duration of services and what kind of options would be suitable to maintain levels of service for the study area. Methodology we used, we first looked into the drainage system thresholds. For this, we used an exposure assessment. Then we looked into the adaptation portfolios. So what kind of adaptation options would be suitable to maintain service levels, and what will be the associated failure conditions. And then we moved on to the retreat strategy, which is the last part. For the drainage system thresholds, we did an exposure assessment. We used a tool called Riskscape from NIWA. The aim of this study was to figure out a way to approach retreat of two-water infrastructure. The best way to do it was to have a physical idea of where exposure was going to happen in the system. So with this tool, we combined two layers, one hazard layer of a 1% annual exceedance event, plus different sea level rise increments, and we overlaid that with two-water infrastructure asset data. And this gave us two things. We could see when assets were being affected, so at which sea level rise they were being affected, and we could see spatially where in the system they were being affected. So together with a workshop, we established the following drainage system thresholds. First one was the 30 centimeter one, where it's expected that the gravity-based system will cease to function. Then at 50 centimeters of sea level rise, all the pumps within the study area are exposed and affected. And at 80 centimeters, the amount of assets that are actually being affected per sea level rise increment starts to flatten off. Then the next part were the adaptation options and the associated thresholds. So in the workshop, we validated the exposure assessment. We used this then to look into the drainage system thresholds, and from there on we went into an optioneering session looking at different adaptation options. There was a significant amount of options to maintain service levels until the retreat threshold, but a lot of them would have to be implemented together. So to simplify this, we merged them into different portfolios. As you can see, the first, so portfolio 1 and 2, are mainly focused on protecting the current infrastructure from sea level rise until the retreat threshold. And then the portfolio 3 to 5 are more geared towards accommodating systems, so more transformative portfolios, more to suit more long-term retreat thresholds. In order to have a look at how we're going to phase retreat, we use the retreat typology from Sam Olofsson, also a recent thesis study. And then to maintain the link with the community retreat, we implemented associated planning and land use implications with these different retreat phases. So, for example, at the repurposing phase, there will be a rezoning of the area. We also considered repurposing the area after active retreat has been performed, because during the workshop it became clear that using options that could create extra storage capacity within the system, so for example water-sensitive urban design options, could extend retreat thresholds in other parts of the system. And then complete overview of the different adaptation portfolios together with the failure conditions are shown here. So you can see that the portfolios aimed at protect have a lower retreat a lower failure condition than the more accommodating portfolios. Then the last part, the DUP planning, you can see that the retreat topology as well as the planning and land use signals are already in there. And just as an overview here, so we divided the study area into different sub-areas, each with their own retreat strategy. So sub-area 1 has the lowest retreat thresholds, 30 centimeters. It's the one with the lowest elevation, and it also has a high number of to-water assets being affected at low sea level rise increments. Therefore, the portfolios that were considered were portfolio 1 and 2. And then the exposure intensification also high. So at low sea level rise increments, there's a lot of to-water assets that are being affected. Sub-area 2, we use the retreat threshold of 0.5 meter. It's got a bit of a higher elevation. However, at 50 centimeters, all the pumping stations were exposed, and to reach this retreat threshold, we used portfolio 3 and 4, and then the highest retreat thresholds, sub-area 3, we used also portfolio 5, because we saw that intensification of assets that were being affected by sea level rise only happened at higher sea level rise increments. We also noticed that the planning and land use signals are actually the same for all of the sub-areas, and this is because they are related to the retreat phasing. So they're the same for the different sub-areas, however they are initiated at different sea level rise increments. Now, in the study we used sea level rise increments as retreat thresholds to avoid a deterministic approach of saying this is the year retreat is going to happen. We have, however, here included a few different projections just to have a little bit of an idea of the time scales we are talking about. Then this is the retreat strategy and the complete planning that we developed. Each of these is a different sub-area. So you can see that area 1 has the earliest retreat thresholds. Retreat phases are indicated alongside the different depths. And then the repurposing of the area will happen the earliest in area 1. These water-sensitive urban design options used for repurposing, which, as explained earlier, could create extra capacity in the system. This brought up a need to indicate this in the DAP as well. So this is why we introduced these pathway synergies and conflicts, because these different pathways that you would implement in one part of the system are going to have an effect on the performance of the pathways on the other parts of the system in the different sub-areas. Retreat signals and triggers were also added to the pathways alongside the different retreat phases. Also, this repurposing, the water-sensitive urban design options usually would require more space. So by retreating an area, this would create space to implement these options, and then in turn, these would have a positive effect on the retreat threshold in adjacent areas. And what we would hope is that this forms the basis for a routine or a decision tree that could be used to frame the water infrastructure retreat. You will notice here that it's the same three segments from the methodology, where first we have the asset exposure, based on the vulnerability or exposure assessment of two water assets, as well as expert elicitation. This is then used to divide the area into different sub-areas, each with their own specific drainage threshold. And then we have the adaptation portfolios, which exist from different options, and then each with their own failure conditions, so with their own adaptation thresholds. Combining these will result in a area-specific retreat strategy, each with their own signals and triggers, which in turn, together with the identified pathway conflicts and synergies, will establish a dynamic adaptive pathway planning. Repurposing options can be investigated through stakeholder engagement, and then when implemented, should be investigated and perhaps revised. Some considerations. Quantification of pathway performance. If you would have a model of the drainage system, you could stress test different options and more accurately determine adaptation thresholds. It would also provide a better basis of discussing levels of service throughout these different retreat phases. And then this is similar speaking for the costing of the adaptation portfolios, where costing would provide a better cost-benefit overview throughout the lifetime of the asset. And then this research focused on the retreat of two water infrastructure. However, it's also important to consider the communication involvement of the community, because this is going to be happening alongside a potential community retreat. This has to be further investigated as well. So for the conclusions, the retreat of two water infrastructure was found to be possible by phasing out different retreat pathways in different sub-areas. You could also see that we didn't use retreat as an actual pathway, but rather we used different adaptation options to maintain services alongside different retreat phases until the retreat threshold was reached. This dynamic adaptive pathway planning helped to frame this. We combine it with these different retreat phases alongside the pathways, signaling the land use and planning changes and identifying conflicts and synergies between the retreat areas. And then the routine was found to address the research question, and then hopefully it can form a basis for framing two-water infrastructure retreat in the future. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. Our next speaker is Dr. Rob Bell. Program Leader for the Climate Impacts and Adaptations at NIWA, and he'll discuss the future work for the Resilient Science Challenge.
Tēnā koutou katoa, sorry about the delay. My name's Rob Bell. I'm the co-leader with Mark Dickson. So Mark has covered off some of the aspects of the next tranche of the Resilience Challenge in terms of the coastal theme. So I'm just going to pick out a few highlights for the 3 pillars of the work that we're proposing. So in terms of pillar 1, Mark has covered some of the techniques that are going to be applied to look at coastal change, but certainly we've done in New Zealand, we have a good evidence base for coastal flooding exposure nationally, but we don't have a good handle on what the exposure is to coastal erosion to our properties, our assets, our roads, and our infrastructure. So once Mark's worked through the coastal change, we can then apply that on LiDAR and come up with the risk exposure of these assets. And that'll certainly be building on some of the work, as Mark said, that was last done by Jeremy Gibb in 1977. In pillar 2, which is around understanding the current and future coastal flooding hazard and risk, we want to particularly focus on the flood sandwich. So coastal flooding in the open coast is quite well understood, but where we have a number of issues around knowledge and research and techniques is in characterizing that transition between estuaries and rivers, which is going to transition and move inland and up rivers as sea level rises. And we call that the flood sandwich, particularly in terms of both the compound, estuarine and the river flooding. The other aspect that Karen Bryan and Scott Stevens will be looking at with their students is the effect of human modifications to our coasts and estuaries. So if we're going to put seawalls up, that may exacerbate storm tide and river flooding. So we have to be cognizant of what are our decision pathways in terms of intervening in estuarine and river stop banks, for instance, or do we give more room for the river and allow more room for sea level rise? Thirdly, it's around looking at multi-hazard modelling framework. So we've done a lot of work on just considering coastal flooding in isolation. But as we know, and we've heard of today, coastal erosion will also occur. And so what is the hazard exposure from an eroded coastline looking at coastal flooding in combination? Secondly, there are a number of areas around New Zealand where there's a tidal signal in the groundwater. And so we have to move away from just simply looking at what's coming over the top of our seawalls or our coastal booms, but also look at the combinations of what's coming up through the ground that could cause foundation instabilities for buildings and roads as well from rising groundwater. So these case studies are going to be focused in the Hauraki Plains, Firth of Thames area, and also in the Tauranga Papamoa area. Finally, in terms of Pillar 3 that Judy Lawrence and myself are working on, is how to better enable proactive coastal adaptation in a changing risk environment. So that the new paradigm is things are changing because sea level rise will continue on for several centuries. So we have to get used to change and we have to work with it, including the uncertainties. So in terms of enabling proactive implementation, there's about 5 different aspects that we're going to address. One is adaptive enablers for how you better implement coastal adaptation. And as Judy has mentioned, the RMA reform process is on the horizon, but in the meantime, we still need to address some of the transitional arrangements about getting better implementation of coastal adaptation. And part of that is fit for purpose planning objectives, policies and rules that can be put in place to enable coastal adaptation. Thirdly, how to, in terms of when do we move, how do we move, and what's the lead time? We need to be monitoring signals and triggers to support the dynamic adaptive pathways planning approach. Fourthly, identifying governance enablers that better enable managed retreat, both for communities and for our infrastructure. And Kool has outlined some of the work he's been doing in the infrastructure space. And finally, we need good economic evaluation and testing tools to look at cost benefits on a range of timescales. So looking at how do you compare the costs and benefits or the downsides of a seawall, which might only last or have a shelf life of 10 to 15 years, versus managed retreat that may last for 100+ years and beyond. Finally, in Pillar 3, we also have a joint PhD the topic around versatile adaptation of coastal road networks with the built environment theme in the Resilience Challenge. And that will be a PhD in civil engineering at Auckland University. So essentially that will be looking at how do we get away from a binary approach of adapting coastal roads from just considering protection and fortification or managed retreat, but is there a whole range of adaptation or versatile adaptation options that can be done along similar lines to what Kool's outlined for the Two Waters infrastructure. So that essentially wraps up the presentations and gives you a bit of a hint of what we're doing in the future. So now you've heard from us, we'd like to hear from you. We'll move on now to a question time. In terms of question and answers part of the webinar. So if you have questions and you haven't sent them in, please do so now, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Emma Ryan.
Thanks, Rob. Kia ora koutou. My name is Emma Ryan, and I've been sitting here in the background having a look at your questions that you've sent through. So we've got 17 published questions. Thank you very much for sending those through. I'm just going to pass the questions on to my colleagues, the presenters, who can help answer them. I'm going to answer them by the number of likes. So if you like a question, just click on the little thumbs up button next to that question and it should come to the top of the screen with the more likes it gets. So I'll start with a question from Tom Fitzgerald, which is, do we have any thoughts about the importance of maintaining the conversation and buy-in from communities and decision makers over time? A lot of the focus is about the uncertainty of science, but from Tom's experience, this is the easy bit. This is a great question, Tom, and I'd just like to start answering that question by highlighting the excellent work that's been done over recent years in Hawke's Bay with the Clifton to Tangoio Coastal Hazard Strategy and the engagement of the community there with decision makers over a long period of time, which is ongoing, which really help facilitate the conversations there. And I might pass this question on to Judy Lawrence. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that question from Tom?
Well, just to reinforce that if you're using the coastal hazards guidance, the community is at the centre of the circle that I showed you. So have a good read of it. It is a good read. It is large, but I think reflect on who your communities are within an area, and go wider than narrower would be my key messages. But yes, it is an ongoing and iterative process.
Thanks, Judy. Hopefully that answers the question. The next question is not a question, it's rather a comment from Greg Bennett. He's put in the chat or Q&A box there a link to the Coastal Restoration Trust of New Zealand, so I encourage you to go have a look at that. Right, the next question is again for Judy. Did your report, I think this is related to Sam's work, cover costs of managed retreat in terms of restoring eco-defences? How were nature-based solutions built in to that work?
Yes, it could. The master's thesis looked at the different types of costing instruments and approaches that one could take. And the issue of value-based costing methods are certainly part of that package. So I think if you look at the thesis, you'll see that it's horses for courses, that obviously the natural systems have different timeframes, and there are some economic assessment tools that are better for long timeframes than short timeframes. So it comes back to what the purpose of the exercise is. But certainly we started to look at that. It was more of a desktop study of the methods, but there is work in the third tranche that Rob outlined, which will get into how one can apply techniques such as real options analysis, and that work is live this week, and we're working through it, and there'll be further work coming out of it that will be helpful in that context. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Judy. I'm going to pitch the next question to Mark. This question's actually been answered on screen, but I just thought I'd give you the opportunity to add to that, Mark. The question is, did the national scale analysis of shoreline change start in Northland because of the availability of LiDAR?
Oh yeah, thanks for the question. And I see Matt de Boer from Northland Regional Council's written an answer to that, and certainly the availability of LiDAR is very attractive. Rob sort of alluded to how important that will be when we get to the point in the project where we're looking at sort of national risk exposure to things like erosion and flooding, particularly with our low-lying estuary areas. LiDAR could be extremely valuable for the work that the flooding team are doing. I guess I'd add in addition that it's been really great to work with Matt and Northland Regional Council. The kind of co-funding arrangement that they were able to come up with there allowed us to really focus on that region and employ some extra people and get through that work a little bit more quickly, albeit slowed down slightly by COVID. So that was the other aspect to that was really helpful. Back to you, Emma. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Judy, I'm going to pitch the next question to you again. This is from Dennis Tegg. You emphasised the importance of cross-scale government or governance. If a territorial authority chose a co-governance structure with mana whenua but excluded the regional council, what comment could you make on the likely efficacy of that arrangement?
Well, I think, Dennis, the key was in what I presented. All levels of government need to be involved, and for a very simple reason, that regional councils have expertise and a focus on the whole region as opposed to a small territorial authority, although in some cases they are quite large. And I think the Randerson review highlighted the respective roles that both of those councils have, which are different, and in what respect they might be changed to strengthen the roles of each of those levels of government. So I think that agenda for change is going to help reinforce the need for all levels of government to be involved.
Thanks, Judy. Mark, I'll give you the next question. This is from Chris Cameron in Nelson. To what extent are you looking at coastal overtopping or erosion versus inundation via groundwater rising or stormwater backflow?
Yeah, the groundwater issue is a major consideration. We're sort of, I mean, these projects are relatively early in the development still. It's a 5-year program of funding, and we're sort of within our first year, so we're sort of actively thinking about how we think about groundwater, and we're looking closely at research that's going along in other kind of aligned programs. I'm thinking about things like NZ Rise and other programs where groundwater is being looked at. What I could say is that as we're thinking about sort of multiple hazards, the role that kind of groundwater infiltration could be considered in that context. Scott Stevens, a colleague at NIWA, is working on a project in which we're kind of actively thinking about how we can include groundwater within models alongside other hazards. So I can't give you a very clear answer, aside from to say that we're kind of aware of the importance of that issue and actively thinking about it. I'm not sure if, yeah, it looks like Rob Bell might have something to add there. I'll hand over to you, Rob.
So thanks, Chris. So just to add to that, in terms of wave overtopping, it's reasonably well described for open coast situations where you're dealing with waves, but a lot of the uncertainties and the methodologies don't really exist for that transition zone in estuaries, marshes, lowland rivers where sea level rise is going to penetrate further inland. So the focus, given the limited funding that we have to, well, the constraining funding, is to focus on that area where there are more uncertainties and less development of the methodology. And certainly where the flood sandwiches, where all of those hazards, including groundwater, will bring to bear on the risk exposure. And the other thing is groundwater is being actively incorporated into the New Zealand Sea Rise program out of Victoria University, and particularly focused on South Dunedin and the Firth of Thames area.
Thanks, Rob. Hopefully that answered that question. The next question I'll give back to you, Rob. There's actually two questions I'm going to ask you. One is, should we be exploring shorter life, movable and reusable assets instead of building for 100+ years?
I think you have to do both. You have to look at short-term actions. And while removable buildings is one option in the shorter term, you've got to have an eye on the long-term future as well. So I do worry a little bit about making buildings removable. If you accumulate that across the whole nation, you are in some ways locking in quite a lot of redevelopment of those areas, particularly where managed retreat might be inevitable in the next 50 to 100 years. So we have to be careful we're not, even though it sounds like it's movable and you can get yourself out of that situation, we have to be careful we're not compounding that cumulative effect in those areas.
Thanks, Rob. And the other question is NZTA a partner in the Pillar 3 roading adaptive roading project?
Yes, they will be. And certainly, it's not just state highways that NZTA have responsibility for, but local roads have quite a bit of funding from NZTA for maintenance and so on. So NZTA are a critical partner and will be in that project, which mostly will look at different flexible options for adaptation of roads and then test them in the wave tank or the tide and wave tank. So, and then the second follow-up study will have to include how do we incorporate a dynamic adaptive pathways planning portfolio kind of approach that Kool came up with to the roading adaptation issues in different parts of the country.
Thanks, Rob. Mark, I'm going to ask you kind of a couple of questions now that are coming through. There's quite a lot coming through, so apologies if I do miss something, but there's one that's been bumped up quite high, which is actually, this one is for Rob. Sorry, Mark. Rob, this question is, how is this mahi in the Resilience Challenge linked to New Zealand sea rise? And I think you're probably best placed to answer that.
Yeah, so the focus of NZ Sea Rise is to produce a fit-for-purpose set of projections for sea level rise for New Zealand, and particularly focusing on what we call relative sea level rise that incorporates vertical land movement, which spatially varies quite a lot around New Zealand. So that's the core purpose of NZ Sea Rise, but there's also an impact statement around looking at impacts and risks from sea level rise and seeing how those projections can be better embedded into planning instruments. So Judy Lawrence, myself, Lara Clark from GNS are involved in looking at that. So we're doing something similar to the Resilience Challenge, but we're dividing the work up and treating it like a co-funded project, looking at both national instruments of planning and how sea level rise might fit into those, like the guidance or national environment standard, right down to in the Resilience Challenge where we're looking at policies, objectives and rules and district plans and regional plans. So we're treating the funding as a co-funding arrangement to tackle those planning enablers at all levels.
Thanks, Rob. Mark, I'll ask you the question I was going to ask you now. And that question, there's a couple of related questions around our ongoing work with local councils and regional councils as primary end users for this work. So just any comment you have about the next stage in working with management agencies.
Sure, yeah, thanks Emma, and thanks for that question. Certainly we see both local authorities and regional councils as key partners in the work that we're doing, particularly because this round of funding has very much a national scale focus. We started a program of engagement quite a while ago, I guess a couple of years ago now, before the project had even spun up, involving a bit of a roadshow where we before my time, but Emma and Paul Kinch were touring around the country and talking to stakeholders in that regard, and we're enthusiastic now to sort of follow up now that we've got things up and running and have had a really useful kind of test with working with Northland Regional Council. So yes, our next steps for us really are to start reaching out, and we'll be looking to do that over the upcoming months with different local and regional authorities around the country, working out how we can best work together. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Mark. We might have time for one or two more questions. We've got a lot coming in, so I'm losing track, but there's one that's been bumped up that Judy has answered in there, so I'll leave that one, and you can read Judy's question. That's a question from Jane Gibbs. Right, the next question I'll give to you, Judy. I think it's an important one, is there one go-to place to access technical reports and guidance for coastal adaptation needs in New Zealand?
Not currently, but we're working on it. It's very important and it's a really good question. The main information you'll find on the Resilient Science Challenge website and the Deep South Challenge website. There may be some others that I've missed, Rob, but I think those are the main ones, plus the NIWA and the Climate Change Research Institute at Victoria University, and there's material on the GNS website. So the question is that, yes, we have scattered information, and yes, it is urgent, and yes, it has been recommended repeatedly, and it is also discussed and some suggestions made in the Randerson Review. If you can get to the coastal discussion, which is well into the 531 pages of that report, but it is worth reading and socialising and discussing amongst your people. I'm not sure who's asking that question, but it does need to be elevated to the most liked question.
Thanks, Judy. Right, we're coming close to 12 o'clock, so shortly I'll pass back to Richard, who will close the webinar today. But I just wanted to thank you all for your questions, and there are a lot that we haven't answered, but we will endeavour to capture those and respond to them outside of this webinar at a later date. So we'll let you know about that. So thank you all, and I'll pass back to Richard to close us off.
Thanks, Emma, and mihi nui to all our speakers and to you for participating in today's webinar. We really appreciate the interest and the great questions that have come through that show that this is a really live topic for all of you. So we're really pleased to be able to offer today's session. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. All the speakers are happy to receive follow-up after this. A reminder just to fill in the survey if you can, to provide some feedback. That'll help us prepare for our next webinar. We're planning that for October, and details on a date and a topic to follow soon. So thank you again. Ka nui tēnei, that's it for now. Kia pai tō koutou rā.